Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Among the Russian authors to whom Leo Shestov gives a lot of attention, and for important reasons in his work, All Things Are Possible, is Ivan Turgenev, who I think is probably best known in our time for his novel Fathers and Sons, which arguably introduces the term nihilism into the Russian context and, in some respect, European context by having a character who calls himself a nihilist. But that's not what Shestov is actually going to focus on, except perhaps under the aspect of groundlessness. Instead, he's going to talk a lot about Turgenev and his orientation towards philosophy, towards the West, the Enlightenment, and doing so as a Russian author. And he begins in chapter 17 by telling us that most of Turgenev's works are curious in respect of philosophy. Most curious is his Diary of a Superfluous Man, and he's the first to introduce the term a superfluous man into Russian literature. Since then, an endless amount has been written about superfluous people, though up till now nothing important has been added to what was said 50 years ago. There are superfluous people, plenty of them, but what is to be done with them, no one knows. And he says, there remains only to invent philosophies on their behalf. And then goes on to say, in 1850, Turgenev, then a young man, thus solved the problem. And he turns it into what he calls, a farce following tragedy, or tragedy following a farce, and this being at the essence of his philosophy. You can't take everything completely seriously. There has to be something not quite comic, but something maybe light and superficial about that. And he says, in this lies the substance of his philosophy. And then he also tells us another thing. And maybe this is really at the core of his treatment of Turgenev. It is also obvious in this feeling he has the whole of European civilization behind him. The European civilization of the mid-19th century. Turgenev was the most educated, the most cultured of all Russian writers. He spent nearly all his life abroad and absorbed into himself all that European learning could offer. He knew this, though he never directly admitted it, owing to an exaggerated modesty, which sometimes irritates us by its obviousness. He believed profoundly that only European science could open men's eyes to life and explain all that needed explanation, right? And this is going to be one of the things that will separate him and Tolstoy, talked about in this particular section, but also much later on as well. And he's going to go on and say that listening to Turgenev, one might imagine he'd learned some great secret in the West, a secret which gave him the right to bear himself cheerfully and modestly when other people despaired and lost their head. And then he talks about a year after the writing of the literary memoirs, Turgenev happened to be present at an execution of this murderer, Tropman, who he narrates in Tropman's execution. And we read that, very interesting, when Turgenev relates that at the decisive moment when the executioners, like spiders on a fly, threw themselves on Tropman and bore him to the ground, The earth quietly swam away from under my feet. We are forced to believe him. So not everything is so neat and tidy and clean as Turgenev might be presenting it. And Shestov is going to say men respond only faintly to the horrors that take place around them, except at moments when the savage, crying incongruity and ghastliness of our condition suddenly reveals itself vivid before our eyes and we are forced to know what we are. So this is kind of a, limit case, we could say. And what is the response? Typically, people want to restore normalcy. And why do they? So he goes on and he says, the ground slides from under our feet, but not from long. The horror of the sensation of groundlessness quickly brings man to himself. And he says, Turgenev proved himself in as risky a state at 60 as he was when, as a young man, he wrote his diary of a superfluous man, right? So wanting to get away from the human condition of groundlessness for Shestov is part of what characterizes Turgenev's work and his attitudes towards things. And philosophy can play a role in that. Now, later on, he's actually going to say in the same section, Turgenev is not alone responsible for this attitude. With his lips speaks the whole of European civilization. So that's an interesting idea. Turgenev in Russia is the preeminent stand-in for European civilization and what it has to offer for this fundamental problem of life. And he goes on to say, on principle, all insoluble problems are rejected, right? Even the greatest horrors, even crimes are beneficial properly construed. And he brings up Hegel. He says, in his youth, Turgenev had been through the Hegelian school, and from Hegel he learned what an enormous value education has, how supremely important it is for an educated man to have a complete and finished, most certainly a finished philosophy. So Turgenev is not just Turgenev for Shestov. He is the stand-in for a particularly civilized, cultured, European attitude towards the fundamental experience that we can be struck by at any point of groundlessness. Now, a little bit later, in here we go. In 23, he's going to tell us that the first assumption of all metaphysics is that by dialectical development of any concept, a whole system can be evolved. Of course, the initial concept, the a priori, is generally unsound, but there's no need to mention the deductions. And, this is what we do. We generate, systems of ideas. And he said, with Turgenev, toward the end of his life, he began to realize the uselessness of philosophical systems, at least for solving the problems of life. Now, we take a little detour in talking about women, and we'll look at the issue of what Shestov has to say about women and men in a little bit more detail elsewhere. But he does talk about Turgenev, and he's going to make an interesting contrast to Pushkin and how he treats women as characters in his works. So in 48, he's going to say, Turgenev's Insarov strikes the imagination of Elena, one of his characters, because he's a man preparing for battle. She prefers him to Shubin the painter or Berseniev the savant. Since ancient days, women have looked with favor on warriors rather than on peaceful men. And he said, had Turgenev invested that idea with less glamour, he probably would not have become the ideal of the young. Who does not get a thrill from Elena and her elect? Who has not felt the fascination of Turgenev's women? But, he says, they're kind of stock characters. They don't have that much agency in a lot of cases, because what do? All of them give themselves to the strong male. The males fight with each other, the woman looks on, and when it's over, she submits herself the slave of the conqueror. And It doesn't look like Shestov is actually saying, yes, that's a really good thing. He's kind of equivocal about this. And this is going to come up again in 113 as well, where he says, the opinion has gained ground that Turgenev's ideal women, Natalie, Elena, Mariana, are created in the image and likeness of Pushkin's Tatiana. And he says, that isn't really the case. Why? Tatiana is taking one sort of stand, and he says, in Turgenev, woman appears as the judge and the reward, sometimes even the inspirer of the victorious man, right? So again, it seems like women aren't accorded that much agency in Turgenev's works. In chapter 77, he's going to talk about this clash between Tolstoy and Turgenev, and mixing in Dostoevsky as well. Now, what is this really about? This constant misunderstanding and quarrels between Tolstoy and Turgenev. Well, it has to do with this attitude towards Europe and towards Russia. Tolstoy thinks of Europe as, in some respects, degenerate, over-civilized, not really providing a model that would be useful for Russians, and Turgenev has the opposite point of view. So he says, nearly every one of Turgenev's opinions drove Tolstoy to madness, or was so capable of so driving him. And he talks about Tolstoy and Dostoevsky detesting the European in their confrere. Now it's funny, because he says, here Tolstoy was mistaken, in spite of their psychological acuteness. To Dostoevsky, it was enough that Turgenev wore European clothes and tried to appear like a Westerner, right? And, he says it's not clear that, Turgenev truly was tied in as much as these two are making him with the European. So we get something really interesting coming out of this. Shestov is reflecting on Count Tolstoy's German biographer, right, who says that, it would have been nice if these two had gotten on well. They could have had a long, peaceful correspondence on high subjects, right? What an opportunity we missed. But they represent diametrically opposed attitudes about those very high subjects. And Shestov is saying, if you are indeed passionately committed over the course of your life, you're not really going to be able to just have a nice exchange of ideas or even a debate that's agreed upon or anything like that. And I think he's essentially right when it comes to that. Those sorts of matters tend to be a bit, if they work out, they're superficial, and if they don't, it's just mutual misunderstandings. And this will come up again a little bit later on. There's one other long discussion that involves Turgenev in chapter 2 of book 2 of this, or part 2 of this. And it talks about something quite interesting. So he begins this chapter, a long chapter, by talking about how psychology has benefited philosophy, which is, pretended that we're not really driven by egoistic motives. And psychology reveals to us that the most generous human impulses spring from a root of egoism. And he gives some examples of that we don't have to go through. And he's going to discuss Turgenev in context with that. But first, he's going to veer off on what might look a bit like a digression. He tells us that to really think means relinquishing logic. It means living a new life. This is a very important theme for Shestov, who calls logic and morality police agents. means a permanent sacrifice of the dearest habits, tastes, attachments, without the assurance the sacrifice will bring any compensation. So, this isn't the way most people picture things, including some of our cultural, we could call them taste formers. Artists and philosophers like to imagine the thinker with a stern face, a profound look which penetrates into the unseen, and a noble bearing, an eagle preparing for flight. What a nice phrase there. And Shestov says that's not the way things work at all. Thinking does not make you just this, kind of, we might say, resolute character who exemplifies the best in us. He tells us, and again, this is very typical of Shestov, a thinking man is one who's lost his balance, in the vulgar, not in the tragic sense. Hands raking in the air, feet flying, face scared and bewildered. He's a caricature of helplessness and pitiable perplexity. So now he's going to make a contrast, right? Guy de Maupassant, an important French author, talks about his meeting with the aged Turgenev, right? There entered a giant with a silvery head. And Shestov says, quite so, the majestic patriarch and master, of course. The myth of giants with silver locks is firmly established in the heart of man. But what do we see in Turgenev's prose poems written towards the end of his life? They're pale, pitiful, fluttering, like a bird that has been winged. Turgenev, who has taught us everything, how could he be so fluttered and bewildered? How could he write his letter, towards the end to Tolstoy? Did he not know Tolstoy was finished? The source of his creative activity dried up, so he must seek other activities? Of course he knew, and still he wrote that letter. But it was not for Tolstoy, nor even for Russian literature, which of course is not kept going by the deathbed letters and covenants of its giants. In the dreadful moments of the end, Turgenev did not know where to say or where to look for support and consolation, so he turned to literature, right? He creates something there that is really just a stance, a pose. And he addressed his late enemy Tolstoy as great writer of the Russian land. Why is he doing that? This brings us back to the egoism, because it's a letter from another great writer of the Russian land. So it allows him to maintain some of his self-image, right? To the last, Shestov says, he tried to preserve his bearing of a giant with silvery locks. And Turgenev knew how to pose passably well. And he said, but Gogol and Turgenev felt substantially the same. If Turgenev had done what others did and burned his own manuscripts and talked of himself instead of Tolstoy before death, he would have been accounted mad. He would have fallen into that groundlessness. He would have disappointed his readers who are looking for the great man, the great author who has it all together. And he says, does this not betray a secret to us? Ought we not to see an absolute egoism, an inalienable and great quality of human nature? Right? Psychology is actually helping us understand ourselves. And so here's the verdict that Shestov is going to make. At the moment of what we could call truth, right? At the moment when men are least likely to play the hypocrite and lie to themselves, Turgenev and Gogol placed their personal fate higher than the destinies of Russian literature. And this is what reveals that secret of egoism lurking there in the background for all of us as a response to the human condition, right? So a lot of very interesting reflections here in All Things Are Possible on one very important Russian author that Shestov thinks he must engage with at the time.